in 3 years, we could potentially see 10% of the state will have taken this class. Can you imagine just in 3 years, 10% of the state now is more educated and have studied and read in depth the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence?
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is the show where I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. You're going to love today's show. My guest is Jameson Broggi. He was the Steamboat Institute's 21 to 22 Courage and Education Award winner. Get this, for 8 years, and right after graduating from a Summit Ministries program, he worked tirelessly to get the South Carolina state legislature to pass the REACH Act. It's called Reinforcing College Education on America's Constitutional Heritage. This law requires all college students in the state of South Carolina to take a 3-credit class in which they must read the United States Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers to graduate. It's brilliant. 49 other states need to get on board with this. Jameson attended law school. After he came to Summit Ministries, he's got wide experience in government. He is now a judge advocate in the United States Marine Corps in Cherry Point, North Carolina. Please welcome Jameson to the show. Jameson Broggi, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Hey, thank you so much.
This is a conversation I've been looking forward to for some time, since we connected a few years ago with something really cool that you were doing in the state of South Carolina, and now you're working on the state of North Carolina. Everybody in the United States needs to know about this. We need 49 more states to do what you did in South Carolina. So we'll get into all of that here in just a minute. But you are working with states to restore respect for the Constitution and our founding documents among the rising generation.
That's right. Yeah. So it's called the REACH Act. It's a piece of legislation I wrote. I'm from South Carolina, and I wrote the bill that passed in South Carolina a couple years ago. Passed the state Senate 45-0, the House of Representatives 91-12. You usually don't see such unanimous support for something like this, but it's called the REACH Act. And what it does is, if passed in North Carolina, and what the South Carolina does, what law does is, you can't graduate from a public college unless you take a 3-credit hour class on American government. And we put in the bill that taking a class on American government requires that students have to read certain founding documents for themselves in their entirety.
So the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, some of the Federalist Papers, and I think you had Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail.
That's right.
In that list.
Yeah. And the point there is, again, so I'm so grateful to be an American. I love being an American, especially as a Christian. Like we're in a country that has so many different freedoms protected that I'm very grateful that I can live my life freely. It's something we should be very thankful for. One thing great about being an American is you can be from anywhere, but you become an American and you embrace our values. You're an American. You're not some other person of just whatever background. Like, you are very indeed an American. One of the challenges with that, though, is because America's our freedoms that we have, they're not something we're born knowing. Unlike other countries that base their whole country off of like races and ethnicities, our country is based on certain ideals and values, and those ideals and values are in our founding documents. People are not born knowing these things. Rather, these are things that must be taught and learned. And you're like, what are we talking about? We're talking about like the birth certificate of our country. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You're created by God. You have certain inalienable rights. You're not born knowing these things. You have to learn them. And so that's the point of the REACH Act, because we see that so many people today don't know these things. A recent survey from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni showed that 10% of college graduates think Judge Judy is on the Supreme Court. And a third of Americans that Judge Judy was on the Supreme Court. And a third of Americans can't name a single right in the First Amendment. And so we see we know why it's important. We see that there's a gap that college students don't know these things. And that's the point of the REACH Act, is try to bridge that gap so people graduate college and are good citizens and know our country's founding principles so we can continue to be free.
I want to walk through what the REACH Act involves, what the process was like of trying to get something like that passed. But we need to step back in time just a little bit because you are a Summit Ministries graduate. Not only a one-time Summit Ministry graduate, but a two-time Summit Ministry graduate. I'd love for you to just talk about what that experience meant to your life and how it helped you on the trajectory that you're on today.
So, yeah, it was such a wonderful time. I'm so happy that I got to participate in Summit. So I'm originally from Beaufort, South Carolina, and I went to college at the University of South Carolina from 2011 to 2014. But before I went to college, I went to Summit two different times, two different summers in 2009 and 2010. And they were incredible times. I'm so grateful that I participated in. Before you're going to college, especially at a place like the University of South Carolina, I was already a Christian. It was really important to Summit. What it did for me, it really made me question why I believed, what I believed, and were these things that I believed about the Bible, were these things true? And Summit is not, for people who are unfamiliar, it is very robust. It's not some sort of make you feel good program. It's very challenging, brings you all different kinds of perspectives. And so I got to participate in Summit 2009, 2010, and then I went to college at the University of South Carolina after that.
Jameson, when you went to college, how did Summit help prepare you?
Oh, just knowing in so many ways, it's hard to count, but just in interacting with other students, when people say, why do you believe those things? Not just saying just at the bottom, not reacting in a way that you can't give a response. I knew I was able to say immediately, okay, yeah, I believe the Bible's true. Here's why I know it's true. Here are the ways it's grounded in reality, how it's all interconnected. And then a lot of times people would propose, if they have those kind of questions, because they've heard other different theories. Well, Summit showed me I knew every other theory. I knew about all different kinds of religions that I had never studied before. I knew all different types of theories that are maybe considered non-religious, right? I knew all those things. So I was very familiar with those things. And Summit is the one who helped me prepare those things. So I knew, but whether it was in the classroom or with other students, that I knew what I believed, why I believed it, and was able to give a defense for it.
Wow. Tell us a little about your career trajectory since then, because you serve our nation in a really unique way.
So I'm a United States Marine on active duty. I'm also an attorney. I'm admitted to the bar in both South Carolina and North Carolina in the Marine Corps. I'm a judge advocate. Right now, I'm a criminal defense attorney. And I wanted to go in the Marine Corps because I love my country. I wanted to serve my country. And that going in the military is not something that's required for people to give back to their country. There's many different ways, sometimes more important ways you can do that. But it's something I really wanted to do. I had the ability to do it. I was really thankful I was able to do it. I love my job. And I'm really excited to talk about what we're talking about, because today, these things are so important of what allows us to continue to be free. So you think of the military protecting us externally. These are things that really allow us to be free, that citizens have to know. And it's not my day job. Like we're going to talk about in just a minute. We're going to get into the North Carolina Reach Act. That's not my day job. Every time I've worked on it, I've taken a personal vacation day, gone up to the Capitol in Raleigh. It's not something I'm paid to do. I do on my own time outside of my day job. But I do love my job.
Well, thank you for your service to our country. And I'm so proud of you as a Summit Ministries graduate, so proud of what you're doing. And let's dig in, because we've got something really big to talk about. I love the way you framed it, that anybody can be an American if you commit to certain things. You don't have to be a certain religion. You don't have to be a certain ethnicity. But Americans aren't born with what they need to preserve their freedom. They have to learn it. And in the state of South Carolina, you sensed that it sounds impossible, but it's true. You can graduate from college and have never read the Declaration of Independence. You can graduate from college and have never even read the Constitution. And the level of ignorance in the statistics you quoted is just stunning. But I'd love to. How did you decide that you need to do something about this?
So I never would have just started it off on my own. I started working on this in 2013. I would have never thought while I was a sophomore in college, hey, I'm going to get a bill together. I'm going to get a coalition of people together. I'm going to get a bill that's passed by the legislature. I would have never thought about doing that. what piqued my interest is while I was a student, I found out that it was already the law in South Carolina that people have to take some sort of American government course. It was already the law. Well, I found that law, and then I look at what the University of South Carolina was doing, and the University of South Carolina was not requiring people to take a class on American government. I couldn't believe that. I was like, well, this is what the law says. I thought maybe they don't know about it. So going through the proper channels, I started setting up meetings, things, techniques and things I'd learned from Summit. Okay, I was like, well, let's just set some appointments up, and maybe the administration just doesn't know about it. So I met with first the provost, the vice provost, met with the provost of the university. I met with the president of the university, and they were all keenly aware of the law and just said, well, it's an old law, so we don't want to follow it. And I just thought that was incredible. And they gave all these different reasons of why they couldn't comply with the law. Oh, well, it needs exemptions for students who take this in high school, who take college level in high school. We need exemptions to say the old terminology of the length of it. We need to use the word credit hours because people in 1924 who originally wrote the law, they just didn't know how college worked back then. Like, okay. So what my strategy was because they wouldn't say we hate our founding documents, we're not going to teach it. They give all these fake reasons of why they didn't want to do it. So I just drafted a bill together. So I met with different state legislators who they couldn't believe when they asked the president, he just said the same thing. So I just drafted the bill and I literally put down every one of their objections, which wasn't one of their real objections. These are the problems you say are in the law. All right, no problem. We're happy to accommodate. And we answered every one of their objections in the bill. And they would still lobby against it at the South Carolina General Assembly, but it put them in a tough place because you're the ones who asked for the bill and we're giving you everything you want. So then they kind of had to just come out and say, we just don't think this is important. And then when legislators were able to hear that, we don't think this is important, they're like, well, we think it is. And then we defeated them 45-0 in the Senate.
Yeah, which, South Carolina has become more of a Republican state, but that requires a consensus across party lines.
Yeah, and this is never this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. And we're talking about the very founding documents of the country, something that every politician swears to defend. Every politician say, hey, I'm going to uphold and defend the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence, without view of color, says these are your foundational rights because you're created in the image of our Creator. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. So we had to really tell all the legislators, like, hey, this is not partisan. When this bill actually originally passed, or the law was initially passed in 1924, the makeup of the South Carolina House of Representatives and the state Senate was 100% Democrat. It wasn't a single Republican in the legislature. Then the law had been updated in 1992 and 1998. And on both of those occasions, when that older law was updated, it was updated with bipartisan support. So we used all that as our research saying, hey, this is not some sort of new Republican issue. This is something that we've believed for a long time of how important it is for people to pass on these things so they understand these things to continue to be free, right? It's what our founding fathers believed. Thomas Jefferson, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. John Adams, liberty once lost is lost forever. Ronald Reagan, later, freedom is always is never more than one generation from extinction. And so we had to communicate that, saying, hey, this is not a partisan issue. And at the end of the day, the only people that lost were the colleges themselves. And both the Democrats and the Republicans passed it overwhelmingly. And that was pretty cool.
So this law affected how many colleges in the state of South Carolina? So all publicly funded institutions.
Right. So there's 9 public colleges. There's 9 public colleges in South Carolina. And it's a requirement if you get a bachelor's degree at any of the 9 public colleges. So you take together all the colleges together, the number of total students at any one time, and you average her out, figuring, okay, 4-year degrees roughly. You got a class graduating every year. On average, it's going to be different every single year. But we estimate that on average, about 21,000 students are taking this class now every single year, reading America's founding documents for themselves. And so just in a few short time, you see the statewide impact that that's going to have in South Carolina.
Wow. I love it. By the way, I think I might know the answer to this, but What is it that keeps the college presidents from ignoring the new law in the way they ignored the old one?
So, in short, I think it was really the political pressure. They just thought, really, you think, hey, there's a law, you're breaking it, there's consequences, right? I mean, you'd think that, but you always have to have who's going to enforce those consequences. Well, you're talking about administrative law where you have a government agency that's refusing to comply with the law. It's those kinds of things are usually more forced through political will. Usually, when it's a fight between an executive branch and a legislative branch, you got to have the legislature saying this is why it's problematic for us. So I proposed. I mean, we had different ideas. Okay, well, I had one proviso drafted up in the budget that said this never passed. So this is one of our ideas. Well, if the president doesn't comply, he loses half of his salary every year. So you said what makes compliance now? One, we removed every possible objection that they could ever think of. We had lots of different experts get input on it, saying, no, this makes sense. It'll work. And then, so now that that's done, and then it passes in 2021, 45-0 in the Senate and 91-12 in the House, those presidents, those colleges know, oh, if I don't comply now, I'll actually get removed now. And we kept that provision in the older law that says a college president who chooses not to violate, that alone is sufficient cause for removal of the college president. And so then once we updated, every single college moved to comply and are now complying.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing where they were saying it couldn't be done. And then when all of a sudden they realize I could be fired if I don't do it, then they can find a way it can be done.
And it was so ridiculous. I mean, we had there's 9 public colleges. There were at the time a couple of colleges that were complying. So they said, oh, it can't be done. It's like, well, I know it can be done because I'm watching it being done right now. And you said, hey, we need this in 49 other states. The REACH Act, I wrote that for South Carolina. We're moving to very similar legislation in North Carolina. There's actually already 8 other states that had similar laws already. And I did the research. It took a long time, but I cataloged each one of those laws. And then I also cataloged with that every single public college in those 8 states and whether or not they were complying. And every single public college in all of those 8 states were complying with the minimum of a 3-credit hour American government class. And they're like, it just won't work. We don't think it can be done. I'm like, well, I know it can be done. And we were able to show that to the legislators, and people saw that. They're like, wow, this is just really arrogance on part of the colleges that we just don't want to do this just because we don't think it's important or we want to break the law.
Wow. Well, I'm amazed. So it passed in 2021. And you started to work on this as a student in 2013. So 8 years you worked on this, during which time you were an undergraduate, a law student, starting your career.
That's right, yeah. And then it finally passed right after I commissioned, but right before I went active duty. It went through the final process in the legislature. And it was great to go to the governor's office. That was a lot of fun. I wasn't expecting that. And we got to go, and the governor was going to give the pin to the key sponsor of it. And the key sponsor said, oh, no, make sure you give it to my wife and I who were there. And so that was pretty cool. But yeah, it took 8 years. And there was, so you can imagine 8 years, that's over 4 different legislative sessions. You can imagine there was far more failures than winning. There were so many committee hearings where we would fail in, where you wouldn't get the right legislators on the committee, might have close relationships with the colleges, whatever it was. So we failed far more than we won, but we never stopped. And it really took the public seeing what was happening. I filed a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests with the universities where I would have the senior officials at the university saying this is dumb or making fun of legislators for proposing it. And so when other legislators saw this, oh, they're making fun of me behind my back. It took a long time, a lot more failures, but after 8 years, we won and they lost.
Wow. And 20-some thousand students every year are now getting exposure to America's true founding, not through the eyes of, Howard Zinn, Marxist history, but through the actual founding documents.
Right. And look, any professor can teach it however they want, right? So like all we said is at a minimum, students have to read the documents for themselves. So, hey, professor, you can give your commentary if you want, but you know what? Students have to read the Constitution for themselves. You can give your commentary on the Constitution, but now you have to read 5 of the Federalist Papers. So you have your commentary, James Madison will have his commentary too. And so I'm fine with that because, look, I think students are smart. I think if they see both, all we want is them to see the documents for themselves, to form their own opinions. But people are so worried that if they see the documents, they might actually like them. And so they don't want that. And that was actually one point of contention. I had several different, some of the representatives from Clemson University, one of the public colleges, saying, well, we don't think it should say that students have to read the documents. And that was confirmation for us. Okay, if you say you don't think it needs to be in there, that means it needs to be in there. The legislation needs to say, as part of the class, people have to actually read the documents for themselves in their entirety.
Wow. Well, you went from South Carolina then to North Carolina.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Moving to North Carolina. A lot of my family's from North Carolina. My mom graduated from Chapel Hill, graduated from high school in North Carolina, and her side of the family lives in North Carolina. So it was pretty fun moving here. You know, my first duty station after my initial trainings in the Marine Corps, I could have been stationed anywhere in the world. And I got stationed in North Carolina. So I was not disappointed. I was very happy with that. And so I moved to North Carolina as an adult for the first time late in 2021. And yeah, we said, let's get started here in North Carolina. So that's what we've been doing.
Talk about that a little bit, because the North Carolina is different than South Carolina in the makeup of the electorate. And people in North Carolina from the university system, like the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, has enormous power in that state. So, each state operates a little bit differently. What do you can't just say this worked in South Carolina, you guys should do it too. How do you go about from one state to the next to the next?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing, step one is you just got to be involved and be known, right? So when I moved to where I lived in North Carolina, you got to be involved in your community, just whether you have, town hall meetings with your local elected officials, your local state representatives, your local state senators. They're always going to be there. And you have to really show that, hey, I just care about my community, right? You can't just be here, I got this agenda. And you just form friendships, being involved in your community, being involved in your church. You start getting to know people, right? And that's what any just normal citizen American, that's just their normal part of life. And so I asked some of the state legislators from our area, I was like, hey, would you be interested in introducing this? They're like, yeah, that's a great idea. We should absolutely do that. So we drafted the legislation similarly than South Carolina, but we had to tailor it to North Carolina, the way North Carolina state law sets up its public colleges. So the North Carolina law, just for perspective here, is going to have a massive impact if it passes the way we currently have it drafted. So the North Carolina REACH Act right now has passed the State House of Representatives. It's pending in the state Senate. The North Carolina REACH Act requires all students at public colleges who get a bachelor's degree. It also requires students at the public community colleges if they get a 2-year degree. Like, what does that mean? We estimate now that if this passes in North Carolina, an estimated 345,000 students will take this class every year in North Carolina. North Carolina has a population of 10 million people here in our state. That means in 3 years, we could potentially see 10% of the state will have taken this class. Can you imagine just in 3 years, 10% of the state now is more educated and have studied and read in depth the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence?
That's remarkable. That changes the nature of the electorate in the future.
And just citizens knowing, even more about their government, it really empowers the citizen. It really protects our rights and freedoms as Americans, which really should be our goal at the end of the day. And so I asked some of the legislators to introduce it. And what really is key here is so my legislators always had an ear, right? Because I know them. They're from my area. But you got to get broad support from around the state. And so it took a lot of work, but just going through friends and family that the people you know in your community. Hey, do you know anyone from Greensboro? Hey, do you know anyone who lives in Raleigh? hey, do you know anyone who lives over in Winston-Salem? Can you have me put them in touch with their legislator? Because if I just call a legislator randomly, he might call back, but he might not. But if he gets connected through a constituent to me, now I got an appointment. And so you had to really build it takes a lot of work, a broad coalition of people from all over the state. It can't be from one area. And then you got to get some of the policy groups involved too. So we have 4 or 5 different policy groups that are interested in this and says, no, we support this. Because going against this, you're going by proposing this, you have a mammoth operation against you. Say, what am I talking about? The University of North Carolina system has 16 public colleges. The system has full-time lobbyists that are working for it. Cumulative total of their salaries is over $500,000 a year, so those of their 3 lobbyists. Additionally, each of the individual public colleges within the system as a whole has its own lobbyists. So you're talking about a team of 19 people that are working full-time. This is their full-time job against just citizens who have other day jobs trying to work on this. So it's really, that's why you have to have the broad coalition for legislators to know, like, wow, like my citizens actually want this, because at the end of the day, they need to be hearing from their own citizens. That way they know there's an interest in this, not just what the colleges are telling them, because the colleges are going to tell them, we don't want this. We think this is a dumb idea, because they don't want any type of control from the legislature, which is interesting because the colleges in the first place were created by the legislature.
Right. I know in the state of North Carolina, it's become more controversial. They're ideological opponents to it as well. What are some of the people saying who think it's a bad idea? Because it's tough. They can't really come out and say, we hate the Constitution. What do they say? What kind of difficulty are you?
Yeah, so they say a lot of different things. So like we said in South Carolina, this passed almost unanimously. It was wonderful. But here in North Carolina, we have faced opposition. For example, 673 professors at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, signed a petition against it saying, hey, don't pass this. This is a bad idea. So they have several different arguments. One of the arguments they have is it's inappropriate for the legislature to have input. They say, oh, we as the faculty, we're the only people that gets to have input. And our response to that is, we're talking about a public entity created by the public. Why can't the public have input on a public entity that the public created in the first place? Further, we're talking about one American government class, 3 credit hours. So a bachelor's degree, most of them are around 120 credit hours. We're talking about one class. So they're getting uptight over 3 credit hours. That's 2.5% of the entire degree. So from our perspective, we're delegating you enormous authority, enormous discretion. You get to decide over 97.5% of your own decisions here over the core curriculum. We just want input on one class. And so that's one of their arguments, like, well, there should be no input at all. Sometimes they say, oh, this will cost too much. Oh, really? So they say, this would be a waste of money to spend money on teaching students the Constitution. Well, first off, it's the first time I've ever heard liberals be concerned about, fiscal responsibility. But let me lay that aside. What we point out is what they do spend their money on. This is where it's always very persuasive to everyone when they hear this. So Chapel Hill, for example, requires, not electives. We're not talking about money they spend on elective classes. We're talking about requirements. Chapel Hill requires all students to take a 3 credit hour class in global understanding. Chapel Hill requires all students to take a 3 credit hour class on power, difference, and inequality. And then when you look at the classes that students can take as options to fulfill those requirements, they include things like, global environmental justice. I don't know what that means. Or there's another class, real title of a class called Art and Fashion from Rome to Timbuktu. That's the name of a real class at Chapel Hill that can be used to fulfill a required course. So our point is when they say, oh, we just don't have the money to do this, are you really asking us to take a close look at your budget? Because I think we can get creative real fast in how you can stop wasting money on things that are unimportant to things that are actually important. So those are the objections we get. All their objections, I love hearing the objections because we are able to answer every single one. I just have an FAQ sheet that we give to the legislators. We say, here's all their objections. Here's our response. And those are the types of objections they get. We always win. If we can ever get an audience, we always win because people hear what the response is. Things of like it costs too much or the legislature shouldn't have input.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned, you said this is bipartisan. This is about our founding documents. It's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. Some of the press I've seen tries to cast it as a right-wing something or other, as a way to defeat it. When the legislators ask you about that, how do you respond?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that people have said that. We just point to like what's been done in other states, what's been done in South Carolina most recently, that this has never been partisan. It's only become partisan because some people tried to make it partisan. They knew that was the only tool they had to build a coalition together. And it's unfortunate that happened. The good news is that we still, even though we did have significant partisan opposition, we still did get bipartisan support when it passed the House of Representatives. And so, like if you're a legislator, like, that game, that happens, that some issues all of a sudden just become, okay, the two caucuses are going to split. So they know that, which is good for us because they'll see that, okay, this happens sometimes. Does this mean I want to stop and not do it? We try to make it bipartisan. Sometimes we're successful. And I still, it already is bipartisan now, not as much as the one in South Carolina, but we're just open and honest. We're saying we're not going to compromise our principles. But it still is a good idea and should be done anyway, even if there is a percentage that's trying to make it partisan, even though it's not.
Jameson, after the South Carolina bill passed, you received an award called the Steamboat Award for Courage in Education. And congratulations on that, by the way. That might have been, I can't remember if you and I were corresponding about the bill before it passed, but I definitely saw that video. Have you had other states from that say, we want to be next?
Yeah, actually a couple. I remember that was fun. And it was, you work so long on it and you're doing it for free. I've never made a dime working on this. And so it was nice, it was neat to be recognized. I was pretty grateful for that. It was nice too, because most of the recognition I got was from the colleges and it was very negative. And so to hear like, hey, I think that's a cool idea. That's great. Like, here's a plaque. That was kind of neat. Yeah, a couple states. We're doing it here in North Carolina right now. In Ohio, there's another bill. It's called the Higher Education Enhancement Act. It's a much broader bill. It does a lot of different things. But one section of that bill is verbatim the North Carolina REACH Act. The drafters of the bill literally took the language of the REACH Act and included it into their larger bill. That in Ohio, to graduate from a public college, you'd have to take an American government class and you have to read those documents for yourselves to pass. And that you're like, well, okay, that was introduced. Did it go anywhere? Yeah, it passed the Ohio State Senate overwhelmingly. It just passed in December of 2023, just last month, the last committee it needed to pass in the House of Representatives in Ohio. There's a lot of talk, if you Google it, there's a lot of media and fanfare on it because people don't like the bill, the colleges specifically. I don't know if it'll pass the full House of Representatives. It passed all the committees it needed it to do. The Board of Trustees for Ohio State University passed a resolution saying this is a terrible idea. You shouldn't pass this bill. So now that bill, I didn't work on at all. I worked the one here in North Carolina just on my own personal time, but it was neat to see, wow, other people thought that was a good idea and without doing anything, not a single phone call, anything at all, to see that move in Ohio. So yeah, that was pretty cool. And then, of course, you have just the other 8 states that already have laws just that had already existed previously.
Well, it makes sense to me that every student attending a public college or university in the United States of America should receive this education. Even international students, and there are a lot of international students in our system, it seems to me should receive this as well, to understand better the nation in which they're studying and the system in which they're getting their degree.
Yeah, again, you can be from anywhere, and it's just what makes our country so wonderful. And you become an American, you embrace our values, you're an American. Like there's the old adage, like, hey, I moved to France. I lived there for a long time and never became French. I moved to Russia, lived there for a long time and never became Russian. We moved to America. What do you become? You don't become just a citizen. You become an American. And yeah, so no matter where you're from, these are very important things to study. And we have exemptions where if you're an exchange student, this is in the bill. Like if you're an exchange student, you're just there for a semester. It's not going to apply to you because you're just getting some sort of brief learning and you're going back. But if you're getting a degree, no matter where you're from, if you're getting a bachelor's degree, it's a requirement. Whether or not you're studying math, whether or not you're actually studying history, business, whatever, no matter what your degree is, if you're getting an undergraduate degree, you have to take this class. And again, we know there's room. They say, hey, there's no room in this. Look, if you have room to require some of these other things, there's definitely room for something more important, something so important as American government that really protects our freedoms and is essential to the survival of a free republic.
Yeah. Well, Jameson, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for doing this on behalf of the rising generation. Thank you for taking your free time, your own personal time to make this happen. I know this show is watched by a lot of people, listened to by a lot of people. And if you're watching or listening now, there's several things I want you to take away from this. Number one is nothing about changing a law is simple, but really important changes are worth it. They take time. Number two, somebody can do it who is volunteering, who is on their own time. You can have that kind of an impact. And the third thing is, what are you doing in your state? People from all 50 states and many different foreign countries are watching or listening to this show right now. What are you doing in your state? And if you need to get in touch with somebody to talk about this, then reach out to me. You all know my email address, jeff@summit.org. You can reach out to me, and I'll try to help make the connections here to make that happen.
Yeah, thanks again for talking about it. I think it's so important. It was fun talking about it a few years ago. Even some of the people that you know in North Carolina have been really helpful, making those connections. So, it's just been a blast. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man. I'm so proud of you. So grateful for your testimony about Summit too. As we're every year you start over again recruiting students to attend, and for them to hear from somebody who's been through and seen the impact that they've been able to have is enormously energizing.
No, it was fun. Summit made such a big impact, and it's something I've carried on. Think about the proximity of when I started working on this Summit. I had just come from Summit, and I had that backing of why these kinds of things were important. We talked about our Christian faith at Summit, right? I didn't even talk about it on the show. Like, we went over things like American history. And so I had just come from Summit with that understanding and, equipped me very well, and things that you taught me of like, hey, like if you work hard, you can make a difference if you put the effort into it and really seek that mentorship and making those connections. And then look what happened, 8 years later, we actually have a result, and hopefully we have a better result here even sooner here in our state, North Carolina.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. Well, thanks so much, man. Thanks for coming on the show today. This is a super, I'm getting really pumped up. This is fantastic.
Thanks so much.
Thank you to my guest today, Jameson Broggi, for coming on the show. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope you were as inspired as I was, that you can make a difference, but you have to stick with it over the long haul. If you enjoyed the show, would you consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? Reviews actually do help more people find the show. I know every podcast host says this, but it really does make a difference. If you'll take just a couple of minutes to do it, more people will find out about the Dr. Jeff Show. And they'll find out more about Summit Ministries. Summit Ministries is the producer of the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. And as you know, Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, a church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources. Lots of great things there for you. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources to find out about the programs, the articles, the videos, the ebooks, and more that we offer. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. Download it at edify.app, spell EDIFI. And then you can also search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store.